Chihoko Goto, Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director of the Asia Program here at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation about Taiwan and the prospect of its technology capabilities being an integral part of both its economic as well as defense strategies. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 3 years ago, the world has become acutely aware of the interconnectedness of the global economy and the fragilities, as well as the possibilities that mutual dependence brings. And the world has awakened to note just how critical a role Taiwan plays in keeping the global economy literally running, and that advanced technology simply would not exist today without Taiwanese manufacturers. Taiwan, of course, produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, and its dominance in this critical sector was a result of strategic planning on the part of private companies, as well as government support, not to mention the fact that the United States hesitated from investing and promoting a homegrown industry. At the same time, the surge in global interest regarding Taiwan's role in advanced technology has also raised the visibility of Taiwan's political and really its existential challenges. Uniting with Taiwan remains a core interest for the People's Republic of China. And Beijing has stepped up efforts by land, by sea, in cyberspace through disinformation campaigns to make its position regarding Taiwan clear. And China has also intensified economic pressure against Taiwan, highlighting Taiwan's economic vulnerabilities depending on Chinese markets. But of course, China has weaponized its economic dominance, not just towards Taiwan, but also towards Australia, Lithuania, South Korea, Japan, the list goes on. Not only is there greater awareness of Beijing's coercive actions, but there is also momentum to take collective action against Chinese coercion and to develop a roadmap for collective economic security. The question for Taiwan is, what would collective action against Chinese economic coercion look like? And how could that contribute to Taiwan's economic resilience in the longer term? Another question, of course, is the effectiveness of the so-called Silicon Shield in both garnering support from Taiwan's allies as advanced economies, including the United States, step up efforts to bolster their own chip manufacturing capabilities. I'm very excited to be joined today by two leading experts to discuss these fundamental challenges confronting Taiwan. We have Shelley Rigger, who is the Brown Professor of Asian Politics. She is also Vice President for Academic Affairs, as well as Dean of Faculty at Davidson College. She is the author of a number of books on Taiwan and Taiwan-China relations, and her most recent work is entitled The Tiger Leading the Dragon: How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. And also joining us today is Dan Blumenthal, who is a senior fellow at AEI, who also leads the China Economic and Strategy Initiative at Project 2049. He has served in the US government in a number of capabilities, including as Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the Department of Defense, and as Commissioner on the congressionally mandated US-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He is also the author, most recently, of The China Nightmare: The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State. So let me first turn to you, Shelley. So at a time when the global economy has slumped, Taiwan's GDP has surged during COVID as demand for its products has exploded. We're now seeing some softness in Taiwan's growth, and there's concerns about overcapacity of chips worldwide. How has Taiwan been able to leverage its dominance in the advanced technology sector effectively? And how is it preparing for shifts in the global economy that's focused as much on resilience as much as cost effectiveness?
Thank you, first of all, Chihoko, for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be with you and with Dan. I've been thinking about this question of the trajectory of Taiwan's economy and how Taiwan is or is not situating itself for the changes that are coming or may come in the future. And it strikes me that after having a long history as one of the world economies that we think of in the tortoise versus hare metaphor as a hare, always racing forward, experiencing for decades very high GDP growth rates, very rapid industrial transformation. One of the virtues that is constantly referred to for Taiwan's private economy in particular is its nimbleness, the nimble Taiwanese small and medium-sized enterprises which are able to pursue economic opportunities, to change business and retool for new kinds of demand. This is something that, we've always associated with Taiwan. But I think in the current age, Taiwan also has some attributes of a tortoise in the sense that it has more ballast in the economy than was the case before the emergence of its high-tech ecosystem. The high-tech ecosystem is only nimble to a limited extent. There's an enormous amount of fixed cost and kind of long-term investment implied by the kind of high-tech firms, including foundry, semiconductor manufacturing, but a lot of other sectors within the tech world that Taiwan plays a big role in had this kind of longer time horizon and greater fixed cost. And I actually think, just as people used to worry, Taiwan, too dependent on the necessity to be constantly reinventing itself. And the businesses, if they're not super nimble, they will not be able to keep pace with changes in demand. That turned out not to be the case, right? Taiwan has reinvented itself, or the Taiwanese economy has reinvented itself repeatedly and remains now, the homeland of some of the world's most important companies. Certainly TSMC is, among the world's very most strategically and economically important companies. So while I recognize that there is always going to be, there will always be shifts in demand and shifts in profitability and changes in the sort of the expectation of the market, changes in the composition of the market as other countries bring high-tech manufacturing capacity online instead of kind of allowing Taiwan's comparative advantage in those industries to sort of prevent their own moving into the sector. I think Taiwan still is in a strong position. The tortoise may not have a lot of forward momentum and velocity, but it has a lot of weight, and it's very hard to move beyond it or to totally reduce or end reliance upon it. I mean, just the size of Taiwan's role in high-tech manufacturing is pretty substantial, and it's, it would take a long time to replace that capacity in other places.
Okay. Thank you for that. So I think you are very cautiously optimistic about Taiwan's trajectory, building on its success that it's had. And I think that what you're highlighting here is that even as countries start investing in their own capabilities, that there's going to be a significant time lag. And hopefully before there is that catch-up, Taiwan could actually invest in other emerging technologies as well and diversify. some of its economic base as well. I'd like to turn to Dan now. So there is this idea of growth in the Taiwanese economy, but growth does not happen in a vacuum. Taiwan is under tremendous political as well as economic pressure from the PRC. And again, economic coercion, China weaponizing its economic advantages and its dominance in the global economy is not unique to Taiwan. Taiwan is certainly not the only government that's facing this kind of pressure, but it is uniquely vulnerable to it. What kind of coercion has Taiwan really had to confront? And what are the possibilities or prospects for Taiwan to actually be able to overcome some of these pressures?
Well, thank you for the question, and thanks for having me. I'm very pleased to be here and also be speaking with Shelley Rigger, who's such a great expert on Taiwan. So thank you. So the coercion is felt, I think, in a comprehensive way. It's not divorced from Chinese, from People's Republic of China military strategies of coercion and intimidation and political strategies and so on. But in terms of economic coercion against Taiwan, it's multifaceted. So there's the type of indirect coercion that companies, multinational companies that are not Taiwanese face if they even identify Taiwan on a map as a separate political entity. They get enormous pressure from United Airlines to Snickers. You know, they get pressure to remove that map and to call Taiwan what China wants it to be called. You know, there are companies that sell needed weapons to Taiwan. They get pressure not to, or get sanctioned if they do, and that's obviously a form of coercion. It's all in the same category, in the same strategic thinking mindset of how do you isolate the island? How do you break the island's morale and send a message to its people that it can be isolated? And of course, there's more direct coercion, usually targeted at supporters of the Democratic Progressive Party rather than the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, although both sides feel the coercion. But that's also done through special incentives and inducements for those who might carry a more pro-PRC mantle in politics or public life. There are incentives for them to do so. There are economic and business incentives to do so. And then there's pressures on companies and industries that are more associated with Democratic Progressive Party voters in agriculture and so on that are put under quite a bit of coercive pressure. And then finally, I'd say there's also, we're talking about the TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. So there is corporation, there is enormous pressure that's not necessarily politically motivated, but pressure in terms of scooping up talent, trying to steal intellectual property. And of course, all advanced industrial countries face, but TSMC in particular, China wants so badly to build a competitor to TSMC and have so far really failed to do so. But the pressure on that particular company, the sweeping up of talent, the sweeping up of intellectual property, is just really immense and a problem that Taiwan faces, as does so many other, as do so many other advanced companies throughout the world. I'll close by saying that on the other hand, China is careful still. It's so dependent on importing from TSMC and other IC companies, just like when it had this pressure campaign against Australia, but it left alone those industries from which it is dependent on imports. It is careful to a degree because it still is so dependent on IC imports from Taiwan. So it's a targeted campaign of coercion. It's part of a strategic campaign that pressures Taiwan into taking political actions and might otherwise not to, absent that coercion.
Thank you, Dan. You've made a few interesting points, but let me turn to your point about China's strategy about trying to isolate the island and to break the morale of the Taiwanese people. The United States has really stepped up efforts to provide political support, military support. On the political support side, it could be a double-edged sword. Military support too could also have challenges too. But when it comes to economic support for Taiwan, has a country like the United States done enough? I'm thinking specifically about Taiwan, the United States coming up with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This is a trade economic initiative that the United States has come up with. It's been seen as the Biden administration's, if not an alternative vision, certainly a companion piece to what's already existing in the region in the form of CPTPP. And yet, although Taiwan really did want to join, it was not part of IPEF. Instead, Washington has a US-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade. And that has its merits as well as its flaws as well. I think the merit is that because it is a bilateral initiative, it will allow the process to move along much faster. But at the same time, it doesn't address issues that are critical to the global economy, such as supply chain resilience. And also there is a lot of disappointment politically in Taiwan as well. So Shelley, maybe I could turn first to you to ask really simply, what can the United States do to support Taiwan's economy moving forward? Has it done enough?
Yeah, this is something that really troubles me because I think we have a lot of political leaders in the US who they want to be viewed as advocates for Taiwan or people who are trying to be helpful to Taiwan, trying to protect Taiwan's security or the sort of sustainability of Taiwan as a democracy under a really severe and like legit existential threat from the People's Republic of China, which would like to, absorb Taiwan into a very much non-democratic state. Yet, some of the most obvious measures that would need to be taken in order to really secure Taiwan's future seem to be perpetually out of reach. And two of them are the bilateral economic agreements that would allow Taiwan and Taiwanese companies to be confident in their indispensability to the US economy. And then the other is Taiwan's integration into regional economic frameworks or perhaps even global economic frameworks, but realistically, we're talking regional, that would help Taiwan avoid being marginalized in the world economy. And, it's proven very difficult either to reach meaningful bilateral economic arrangements with Taiwan or to integrate Taiwan in the US's larger regional economic frameworks. So you just mentioned one, the CP or the original Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, was in part motivated by the desire to create an organization that the People's Republic of China would not dominate, in which the US and other friendly countries might be able to find space for Taiwan. The US abandoned that basically on the first day of the Trump administration. But even on the bilateral front, the US has been surprisingly slow to pursue the kinds of economic agreements that might really give Taiwanese actors the kind of confidence that Dan's talking about in the face of this coercion and intimidation from the PRC. And instead, the US claiming, some of the rhetoric around the CHIPS Act was kind of like pro-Taiwan rhetoric. Like, we're doing this for Taiwan, but actually what we're doing is looking to compete with Taiwan at best and hollow out Taiwan's industry by importing it to the US at worst. So, I think there's a I think American policymakers have a really hard time disaggregating what is US interest, what is Taiwan's interest, and honestly, what is the PRC's interest. And we're acting much more on motivations that have to do with US interests and acting in ways that erode or degrade PRC interests. And Taiwan is kind of a cipher in the middle, and Taiwan's interests often seem to me to be left behind.
So yeah, we're seeing a lot of post-COVID industrial policy, protectionist measures, not just from here in the United States, but across the world. But at the same time, there is this real political rhetoric about supporting Taiwan. Certainly goes hand in hand with the anti-China stance on Capitol Hill. So let me turn to you, Dan, about, is the United States doing enough to come to the aid of Taiwan economically? What can it do to ensure that the Taiwanese economy continues to thrive, not just in the near term, but in the decades to come as we see this shift in the economic order as well as in technology innovation as well?
Well, no, we're not doing enough. And I think that, so we're self-deterring, really. And that's part of the purpose of Chinese coercive and intimidating action, which is to get us to stop doing things that we used to do. The only reason we don't have a free trade agreement, and this predates, the unfortunate collapse of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, although Taiwan wasn't going to be part of that, but still, unfortunate collapse is because we were concerned about how it would look in China, to be honest, to be frank, and that's actually a step backwards because China had agreed to Taiwan's ascendancy to the World Trade Organization, which is already agreeing that Taiwan has an international legal personality, right? So we just self-deterred on that one. On IPEF, not including Taiwan, was self-deterrence, and there was no reason for that. Now, this is not a free trade agreement. It's not a agreement. I think many people in Asia are disappointed with IPEF, and we can talk about that. But still, politically, it was a statement to Taiwan to not include them. I think Shelley's absolutely right about the CHIPS Act. I mean, I would rather have had a SHIPS Act, which actually funded enough ships that can defend Taiwan in the first place, so we don't have to talk about hollowing out or competing with Taiwan's, chip industry, which is a crown jewel. So, and then finally, look, Taiwan's an island, right? So it's not the Ukraine; it can be strangled. It doesn't have NATO members on its borders. It economically can be strangled. That's a strategy the Chinese are going to pursue. They've tested it out. We have to demonstrate that it comes down to this. If China pursues an isolation strategy that's both economic strangulation and military blockading, then either Taiwan isn't strong enough by itself to defend itself against that kind of strategy. The United States and Japan need to. So either the United States and Japan are going to be able to keep open the lines of communication, sea lines of communication, and resupply Taiwan, or they're not. And so the United States and Japan and other allies need to exercise those capabilities that show Taiwan that it can't be strangled. Then the United States and Taiwan need to demonstrate more resiliency, as you've said, in terms of showing the kinds of things that they need to hold out, energy stocks, food, agriculture, critical infrastructure, telecommunications resiliency, these sorts of things. That's how you defeat the threat of an isolation campaign that China is conducting against Taiwan right now.
And that really is like true economic security, right? To make sure that Taiwan can withstand the vulnerabilities that it has as an island, that it is particularly vulnerable to isolation, not just an invasion as well. You mentioned, Dan, Japan, as well as the United States coming to the aid of Taiwan. And I want to turn to this idea of a collective stance towards Chinese economic coercion. Obviously, we've seen many countries face the wrath of China, and there are steps that countries are taking to preempt that. So there's a lot of self-editing, self-censorship. The G7 certainly is aware and is trying to look into ways whether there can be some coordinated effort to push back on China's coercive actions. But then we look, for instance, at Taiwan, the Chinese government saying no to imports of Taiwanese pineapples, right? Unfortunately, I would say, unless you're a pineapple grower, that's not really critical to the Taiwanese economy, but coming to that defense of Taiwanese pineapples plays a tremendous political role, and it does provide a lot of support to the Taiwanese public if there is intervention. So how do we reconcile, like, what kind of collective action can we take? Is there a way that could be a systematic approach to pushing back against Chinese coercion?
Are you? Sorry, was that?
You know what? Since Shelley, since you're smiling away, I think you want to go first, and then perhaps I can turn it over to Dan to follow up.
Actually, that was my delighted face as the question went to Dan. So, I actually am really interested to hear what Dan would say. If I have additional thoughts, I'll jump in. But I think
Sure, and I'll make a shameless plug. We have I'm co-directing at the American Enterprise Institute a project on the coalition defense of Taiwan, in conjunction with some colleagues here, and we built a team up that looks at undermining China's coercive threats, its threats of isolation. We believe actually that the most likely scenario is China ramps up its isolation, both military and economic, at the same time. And we have a paper that just came out that you can access as well, called China's Three Roads to Taipei: Persuasion, Coercion, and Compellence. Anyway, shameless plug aside, it explains some of these ideas more. Look, in the first instance, it's the coalition defense of Taiwan. So because Taiwan's an island, the United States and the countries around Taiwan, US, Japan, the Philippines, to the extent possible, other countries around Taiwan are going to have to demonstrate that they that China won't succeed in blockading Taiwan. So even if the G7 had excellent strategies in terms of what they were going to export or import from Taiwan to replace goods that Chinese boycotted, if you can't get them to Taiwan, then you've got a problem. So in the first instance, you've got a military problem that you can either answer or you can't, and the U.S. needs to be working very vigilantly and demonstrating openly that Taiwan cannot be strangled from the sea. So that's in the first instance. In the second instance, I'd say that resupplying Taiwan from Japan, that has to be a capability that's exercised. You just look at geography. There's no other place where that resupply can come from. And then in the third instance, I'd say that you need to show that you can get the critical stocks, the critical infrastructure to Taiwan. So the and that Taiwan has enough. So energy supply has to last for more than 10 days. Food, agriculture, telecommunications is a big problem because Taiwan has so many undersea cables that can be cut. So space-based redundant telecommunications so Taiwan can communicate with the rest of the world. I'd say two things. One is there isn't actually that much that Taiwan, unfortunately, can learn from the Ukraine fight, because it's an island. Ukraine is on land. So on the one hand, it has a little bit more protection than Ukraine did from that sort of invasion. But on the other hand, it can be isolated. The second thing I'd say, and cut off. The second thing I would say is that people want to turn Taiwan into a porcupine, they say. So you give Taiwan a lot of different kinds of capabilities that it can fight off Chinese ability to land and invade Taiwan. And that's fine. A porcupine cannot be eaten, but a porcupine can be starved, right? So porcupine is a necessary but insufficient. And all this focus here in Washington on turning Taiwan into a porcupine is an insufficient strategy. You have to show economic resilience of the kind that I laid out, the ability to resupply Taiwan, and the ability of the United States and its allies to ensure that Taiwan isn't isolated militarily, economically, or cut off in terms of its communications.
Yeah, so, what I would add to that is one of the things that I think is important for the U.S. in getting this right is to remember what the motivation is for doing so. So one of the trends that I see, and it's very much caught up in the conversation in Washington and beyond Washington over especially how to understand and partner with Taiwan on the military front. So to Dan's point about, there are lots of people who want to tell Taiwan how to structure its defensive preparations. And certainly the porcupine metaphor is way outpacing the tortoise and the hare when it comes to Taiwan. At the same time, though, I think Dan's making a really good point that does the porcupine alone, does this kind of robust defense by itself really suffice? And probably not, right? Yeah, I think it's a great point that the porcupine maybe can't easily be attacked, but it certainly can be starved. So, why are so many American policymakers and pundits so eager to tell Taiwan how to manage its own defense? And certainly part of the reason for that is that many American policymakers and pundits view Taiwan as an important friend and partner in Northeast Asia for the United States for many reasons, including its economic contribution, which I think today is greater than ever. We used to talk about Taiwan as really important for its economic value in the 1980s when Taiwan was making a lot of stuff that could be made really anywhere. It was just, Taiwan was an efficient manufacturing platform for traditional consumer goods. And we thought that was important. Well, now Taiwan is making things that literally are not made anywhere else in the world. And they are at the absolute cutting edge of technology that we really, really, really need. So yeah, Taiwan's important economically, but Taiwan's also important from the standpoint of the preservation of American values in the world and the idea that in the face of things like Russian aggression against Ukraine and leaning in on many other Eastern and Central European countries, one of the most heart-wrenching moments for me in the whole Ukraine war saga, which has been heart-wrenching every day for over a year now, was a conversation with a graduate student in the UK from a neighboring country of Russia, not Ukraine, not Belarus, but another one of the neighbors, who said, I lived my whole life imagining that this was over. And now I realize that actually next, we could easily be next. Any of the Eastern European, any of Russia's border countries could be invaded and destroyed, crushed, broken, bloodied, slaughtered the way Ukraine has been. So like in a world like that, where that is not our future, not the thing that we're worried about, but the thing that's happening right now and that we can't seem to gain a whole lot of traction against, a country like Taiwan, which is democratic, liberal, competitive, economically successful, socially progressive, this is something we need to preserve in the world. And what troubles me is that it seems like a lot of the conversation about Taiwan's military preparation is much more about depriving China of a military asset than preserving for the US and its friends and partners around the world a political asset and a moral asset. So you have people who are actually serious actors, serious players, people listen to them saying, we should sanction Taiwan. We should sanction Taiwan for not doing what I think they should be doing for their own defense. So that's somebody who's already given up on Taiwan. That's somebody who says, you know, Taiwan is not important here. What's important is that somehow the US gets to dictate how Taiwan will be defended, because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just a US military asset that we use to frustrate China. And, you know, if that's where the direction US policy goes, we will fail. We will absolutely fail, because the people of Taiwan will realize, all right, the US is not here for us. So we need to make our arrangement to go peacefully, because the alternative is Ukraine.
I just couldn't agree more with that. And I'm sorry, I know you might have a question, but it's so important in our military planning discussions, in our defense, in our strategic discussions about Taiwan. You know, we would have an interest, you know, even if Taiwan didn't become a porcupine, you know, we would still have an interest in its defense. In maintaining its political autonomy and maintaining its democratic system. And so that's why I emphasize so much that, you know, that our strategy has to be comprehensive in nature, and it has to undermine the entirety of the Chinese strangulation and isolation campaign, economic, but we have a military role in that too. We have to make sure that, and an economic role, that we have to make sure that China doesn't succeed in convincing the Taiwan people that A, we only care about them for the selfish reasons that Shelley mentioned, or B, that we are not a reliable partner in the end. You know, we have to convince them that we have a lot at stake here, a certain world order at stake here, and we have to convince our other allies of that too, if we want to bring them along into a coalition.
And I also think that China's offensive campaign against Taiwan is very multifaceted, including psychological warfare through disinformation. And certainly China has really upped the ante when it comes to sowing the seeds of distrust and unrest within Taiwan about the reliability and the credibility of the United States as well. I know this is not exactly on the economic issue, but I do think that it is something that the United States could actually invest in. So let me ask if there is something that the United States can do to counter that kind of Chinese disinformation campaign, whether it has been effective in ensuring greater confidence amongst the Taiwanese voters about the United States actually being there for them.
Yeah, one thing I would say is I think it's important for the U.S. to speak about this issue in realistic ways. So, for example, most recently, the White House message has been to China has been, look, we're not changing our policy. We still have a one China policy. And in fact, most recently, White House officials said the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence. And I think this is actually very reassuring for people in Taiwan, for most people in Taiwan. It's very disappointing for the advocates of Taiwan independence in Taiwan, but the vast majority of Taiwanese people are quite realistic and pragmatic when it comes to how they must calibrate their own preferences and behaviors in order to avoid the catastrophe of a military conflict. And so they are reassured to know that the accusations from Beijing that the U.S. is encouraging Taiwan and pushing Taiwan in a direction of a provocation, that those accusations are not accurate. Because I think when it starts to feel like U.S. politicians are writing blank checks, many people that I talk to in Taiwan, sort of ordinary, middle class people that are not political, they're not security analysts, they're not academics, they're just, trying to live their lives. And they say, when you start saying things that just don't sound realistic, that don't sound feasible, like you're not actually going to be able to deliver on that, then we start to wonder, like, okay, what are you serious about? So I think it's important for us to calibrate our messages, that is to say, for the U.S. government to calibrate its messages in ways that have credibility among Taiwanese, so that when we say, this is a high priority for us, the security of Taiwan is a high priority for us, that sounds like something we really mean, as opposed to another phrase in a series of phrases, some of which sound a lot like political posturing.
Yeah, I think it's very important to fight in the information space and psychological space and so on. And they're different target audiences. So President Biden, you can have a one China policy and still be very clear with China that you'll oppose the use of force. That's not a contradiction. But you have to, if you're the president, you have to explain why you're saying that. He said it 4 times now. He really has to explain to the American public and to potential coalition partners what he means, right? So we will oppose the use of force. That's a very important statement that China needs to hear, because we don't want another Ukraine where we weren't clear about that. But we're not the provocateurs, and that's very important for our coalition partners to hear, potential coalition partners. I have a lot of this in the paper. Again, shameless promotion, but the Chinese are defining us as the provocateurs. They're saying things that aren't true. We never agreed that Taiwan's part of China. We have to explain to the world that we have a very subtle, complicated policy, but we also made a tremendous concession. We de-recognized a Cold War ally. People don't know this. They're not experts like we are here. They need to know some of the history that we made a concession, that our non-position on Taiwan's sovereignty doesn't affect Taiwan's status in international laws and independent state. They have every right. They have to go ahead and find more international personality. We have to explain all of this. It's a very complicated policy. We also have to explain that we've made enormous concessions already, and we're not provoking. We're holding our end of the policy, which is to not recognize Taiwan. A painful concession as it is. We're keeping to our one China policy, but China is the one provoking by coercing Taiwan. And we have a law. People have to know this around the world, that we have a law. It's a law of the land, the Taiwan Relations Act, that requires us to resist coercion. People don't know this. So we have a lot of work to do in the information space and a lot of work to fight against this disinformation that China's perpetuating in order to break a coalition preemptively. On Taiwan itself, it's exactly as Shelley says, that it's not a pawn in our game. It's part of the democratic world order. It's painful that we can't recognize it as a state, but that's the promise we made. That's what we have to live with for now. But it's not a pawn. It's part of the democratic order, and we're going to do everything we can within our policy to give it international dignity and international personality.
Thank you. So let me turn back to the topic of technology competition between the United States and China, and where Taiwan fits into it. Now we have the CHIPS Act that the Biden administration has put forward, as well as the IRA infrastructure bill as well. But when we look at the CHIPS Act and the export control that was put into place in October of last year, there has been a great deal of concern amongst U.S. allies about how that could actually be restrictive and how that could actually hamper their own growth. What we know, though, is that Taiwan has a lot of experience in keeping critical technology away from the hands of the Chinese government. Do you think the United States could actually learn more and perhaps even have a working relationship in order to move forward on some of these issues about keeping the most advanced technologies, especially in the semiconductor space, from China?
Well, one thing I would say, not from a sort of policy direction, but just from the on the ground reality of Taiwanese manufacturing, is I have actually less concern than it probably sound like based on my criticism of the CHIPS Act or the motivation of the CHIPS Act. I have less concern than you might think about the U.S. being able to replace Taiwan as a manufacturer in this sector, just because the nature of Taiwanese manufacturing is really extraordinary. It's extraordinary from certainly in a U.S. or European context. It's pretty well unthinkable that a facility could operate to the standard that a TSMC fab or foundry operates in the U.S. or pretty much anywhere in Europe. So, for example, the TSMC operations in Hsinchu Science Park in Taiwan have a temperature range in which they can operate that is pretty much not a range. It's got to be exactly this temperature all the time. And there are HVAC technicians on call or even in the facility 24/7, 365 days a year. There is no margin for error. There is no weekend. There is no, end of shift. There is no shutdown. It is all operating at an incredibly high level of technical intolerance for any variation. And it's just really difficult. I had a conversation in January with people at a famous Taiwanese company that is thinking about collaborating with auto manufacturers in the U.S. And, we kind of said, have you worked with, in a union environment? Have you worked in the U.S. before? Do you know what it's like to do business in states like Michigan and Ohio? And they said, we can do it. And I thought, I hope you can, because I'm not sure, because, the Taiwanese workforce is so disciplined, and it's not necessarily good. The working conditions are really tough. People work incredibly long hours and incredibly hard. And, it's just hard to imagine how that transfers. So I think that, and it's also hard to imagine how that transfers, honestly, to mainland China as well, because of another set of inefficiencies and liabilities that are built into the nature of the PRC economy that I think are part of what has made it so difficult for PRC companies with the massive resources of the PRC state behind them, like infinity money pouring into the semiconductor sector in the hope of creating competitors to companies like TSMC, that has been unsuccessful because the particular secret sauce, that exists in Taiwan is also very hard to replicate. Even if you had the technology, even if you had the equipment, even if you had the engineering talent, could you actually run that factory in Arizona or in Jiangsu province? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that human capital development issue, and I know that TSMC going into Arizona at the same time as Intel, two big companies, two big fabs. Really, there's only a finite amount of labor that is able to service those fabs at both the highest level and at the lowest level as well. So then the question becomes, to what extent is this going to be real threat to what's actually being made in Taiwan as well? So it is an interesting challenge, but I don't know, Dan, what is your thought about the United States actually being able to outcompete Taiwan in the semiconductor space, or at least be self-sufficient so that it can actually reduce its dependence on Taiwanese technology moving forward?
I don't think there's any chance that the U.S. will reduce its dependence on Taiwan's advanced semiconductor capability. I mean, I think, look, there's some conceptual confusion in what the U.S. is trying to do. Sometimes we talk about reshoring, sometimes we talk about friendshoring. There's no conceptual confusion. We don't want to be reliant for certain technologies and industrial capacity on China, and there's good reason, we can get into for that. But the strategy has got to be, that it diversifies to other shores where it makes sense. Not that it all comes back to the United States, where it's, for the reasons that Shelley said, less cost effective, and not taking advantage of our own competitive advantage, of which there are many, obviously. So I don't think that TSMC United States will be outcompeting TSMC Taiwan anytime soon. I think the United States has to be more clear in its policy if it's going to be less reliant on China on China, not on Taiwan, but on China for certain capabilities that China is trying to grab the commanding heights in. It's got to be much more clear about the kind of world it wants to see, which would include Taiwan, include Japan, include South Korea, include Mexico, include the NAFTA countries. So again, I don't think Taiwan has much to worry about in terms of being hollowed out. I think the United States needs to have a more comprehensive diversification strategy that involves friends and allies. Something more like the GATT, I guess, before the WTO took off, but that's further down the road.
Right. So I have a question from an online participant, Amanda Walker from Trans Texas Tire, who asks about the resilience of the Taiwanese banking system and its ability to actually weather any of the blockades that Dan, you were talking about. And I think I would actually like to add to Amanda's question about the resilience of the Taiwanese financial system more broadly, insofar as it can actually encourage startup culture and the ease of doing business and the ability for Taiwanese companies to take risks. Because I think at the end of the day, even though you both argue that TSMC will have no real competition moving forward, even when we have all of this reshoring all across the United States and Japan and in Europe. At the same time, what Taiwan, other countries are looking for is the next big thing, right? The next new investment, the next Morris Chang to come up with a industry. And so what kind of ecosystem can Taiwan actually develop in the future?
So this is a really interesting one for me. I can't speak to the banking question, and maybe Dan can help with that one. But I'm trying to think of some other Aesop's fable that goes with this, and the one that comes to mind are the ants and the grasshopper, but I don't think that's exactly right. But it is certainly the case that Taiwanese companies have been incredibly successful. They were incredibly successful in Taiwan, but they were relatively small. But then after the mid-1980s, when Taiwan's traditional manufacturing moved to mainland China, a lot of Taiwanese companies did extremely well in mainland China and became very profitable and much larger than they ever could have been in Taiwan, given the size of the labor force and the cost of land and all the stuff. So there's been an enormous amount of capital accumulated by Taiwanese firms in the traditional manufacturing sector in the mainland. Setting aside for a moment what filled the space that was created when those companies went to the mainland, which is the high-tech economy, leaving that aside, just the accumulation of capital in the traditional sector seems like the kind of perfect opportunity, especially when you pair it with Taiwan's demographic, which is a very slow or zero population growth, maybe even declining population, but still a robust segment of highly educated, young to middle-aged people, right? So there's still a good-sized and highly educated workforce. So plenty of capital and a lot of educated people. That has not spawned the kind of new business creation that you might expect. It has to some extent. I mean, there are some great new companies that have emerged in the last few years. Companies like Gogoro, which is a fantastic model of a replaceable battery. So you pull up in a gas station, on your motorcycle, you pull the battery out, you put it into an array where it recharges, and you get a fully charged one, and you put it in your bike, and it's way shorter, way briefer a stop than even putting gas in a tiny little motor scooter tank. So there are companies that are doing new things in Taiwan, but not as many as you would expect, because capital is conservative, and capital is, as exactly as you just described, Shihoko, looking for something really big, and they look for something really big in the sort of hardware sector rather than in the idea sector or the sort of software application. And I don't just mean computer application, I mean like how we live, new products that change the way we live. It is frustrating to listen to people in Taiwan complain about there's nothing to invest in, and then turn around and say, these young people, they just want to sit around and have ideas. It's like, that's what you need to invest in. So I do see a kind of stutter step in the Taiwanese forward motion that is a little bit troubling. But hopefully, as those conservative capitalists get older, their grip will loosen one way or another, and we'll see some new stuff happening.
I think that's all really well said. My understanding, and we're getting far afield from my understanding here, is that the U.S., the complementarity between the United States, you mentioned Morris Chang, whose story I do know, is the U.S. is the disruptive innovation, capital flows easily to new ideas, and Taiwan has been a longstanding great partner, TSMC manufacturing and fabrication and so on, and that's been the beauty of the relationship. Even if you go back and you read the original Silicon Shield from 2000, the intense relationship between Silicon Valley and TSMC and so on that spawned all these products. The U.S. complains that it doesn't manufacture any things. Taiwan complains that it doesn't have new ideas, and the two found each other, right? And hopefully that'll be the next. I mean, the U.S. wants to manufacture more things. I understand it's important, but I think that our competitive advantage is in this disruptive innovation space, and Taiwan's competitive advantage is this extremely intense, manufacturing fabrication processes, and we work very well together.
Yeah, I think there are many opportunities for U.S.-Taiwan cooperation that go beyond the traditional defense space and the economic space, and I'm thinking also perhaps cooperation on workforce development as well as innovation, which would be a powerful partnership. this has been a really fascinating conversation, but I'm afraid our time has come to conclude our discussion for now. But really, thank you so much, Shelley and Dan, for being here with the Wilson Center's Asia program. I hope we can continue this conversation. Certainly, there will be no lack of interest in Taiwan's economic future. And so thank you again, and thank you for tuning in to this discussion. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.